There are 6 verses in the Bible that have generated more debate, more controversy, more confusion, and more fear than almost any other passage in the entire scripture. 6 verses in Genesis chapter 6. And in those 6 verses, something is described that most churches never preach on, most seminaries gloss over in a single paragraph, and believers have either never read carefully or have read, and quietly set aside because they did not know what to do with it. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Genesis 6:2. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Genesis 6:4. Who were the sons of God? Who were the Nephilim? Why does the Bible connect their appearance directly to the decision of God to send the flood? And why? Of all the things that could have been in the Dead Sea Scrolls when they were discovered in 1947, did the ancient Jewish texts hidden in those caves spend more time on this story than almost any other passage in Genesis? The answer to those questions does not lead to a comfortable place. It leads somewhere far stranger, far darker, and ultimately far more theologically significant than most people who sit in church on Sunday morning have ever been allowed to explore. This is the story of the Nephilim, what they were, where they came from, what happened to them, where they appear again after the flood, and what the Dead Sea Scrolls, hidden for 2,000 years in the caves of Qumran, reveal about how the ancient Jewish world understood this passage long before modern interpreters decided it was safer to explain it away. Fasten your seatbelt, because the Bible is about to tell you something that your tradition may have never told you, and it is going to tell it in its own words. Let us begin at the beginning. Genesis 6 does not exist in isolation. To understand what it is describing, you have to understand where it sits in the structure of the book of Genesis and what has already happened in the chapters before it. Genesis 1 and 2 establish the creation of the world and of humanity. God makes everything good. He makes man and woman in His image. He places them in a garden. He gives them authority over the earth. Everything is ordered. Everything is in its proper place. Every category of being is clearly defined. Genesis 3 introduces the catastrophic rupture. The serpent, already identified in Christian theology as the one who would become Satan, enters the garden and deceives the woman. The man follows. They disobey God. The consequences cascade through every dimension of existence. Relationship with God is broken. Relationship between man and woman is distorted. The ground itself is cursed. Death enters the human story for the first time. Genesis 4 shows the acceleration of that catastrophe. Cain murders Abel. The first death in human history is a fratricide, and the line of Cain produces Lamech, who boasts of killing a man and is proud of it. Violence is spreading. The corruption that entered in Genesis 3 is multiplying across generations. Genesis 5 gives the genealogy from Adam to Noah, 10 generations. Each generation described with the same formula. He lived, he had sons and daughters, and he died. Over and over again. The rhythm of the chapter is the rhythm of death. Death, death, death. The one exception is Enoch, who walked with God and was not, for God took him. Genesis 5:24. We will come back to Enoch. His absence from the genealogy of death is not accidental. And then Genesis 6. Immediately following the genealogy of death, immediately following the story of a world filling up with violence and corruption, the text describes something that is either a cosmic escalation of the catastrophe already underway, or a completely separate invasion from outside the human sphere. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Genesis 6:1-2. The Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Genesis 6:3-4. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Genesis 6:5-6, 6 verses. And within those 6 verses, 3 questions that have divided interpreters for more than 2,000 years. First, who are the sons of God? Second, what are the Nephilim? Third, what is the connection between the sons of God, the Nephilim, and the decision to send the flood? Let us take each question in order, because the answers, when laid out with full honesty about what the text actually says and what the ancient Jewish sources actually understood, are not what most modern Christians have been taught. Who are the sons of God? There are 3 major interpretations that have been held across the history of Jewish and Christian interpretation. They are not equally supported by the text, they are not equally ancient, and they are not equally consistent with the rest of what the Bible says. But all 3 deserve to be presented honestly, so that you can evaluate them for yourself. The first interpretation is what scholars call the Sethite view. This interpretation, which became dominant in Christian circles from roughly the 4th century onward, understands the sons of God as the righteous line of Seth, the 3rd son of Adam, and the daughters of man as the unrighteous line of Cain. On this reading, Genesis 6 is describing the intermarriage of the godly with the ungodly, and the Nephilim are simply the human offspring of those mixed unions. This interpretation has a certain theological tidiness to it. It avoids the uncomfortable implications of the alternative, and it became the standard view in many Christian traditions precisely because of that tidiness. But it has serious problems that the text itself creates. The term sons of God, in Hebrew Bnei Ha-Elohim, does not appear anywhere else in the Old Testament referring to human beings. Every single other occurrence of this exact phrase in the Hebrew Bible refers to supernatural beings. Job 1:6, Job 2:1, Job 38:7, Psalm 82:6, Daniel 3:25. In every one of those passages, Bnei Ha-Elohim refers to angelic or divine beings, not to human beings, however righteous. The Sethite interpretation requires the term to mean something it never means anywhere else in the entire Bible. That is a significant textual problem that cannot be dismissed with a wave of the hand. Furthermore, if the sons of God are simply the righteous descendants of Seth, why does their intermarriage with the daughters of Cain produce the Nephilim, described as mighty men and men of renown? Ordinary human intermarriage between 2 groups of people, however righteous one group and however wicked the other, does not produce a category of beings described in these terms. The offspring of Seth and Cainite women would simply be human beings. Nothing in the text suggests otherwise. Nothing in the Sethite interpretation can explain why God responds to this intermarriage with a decision to destroy all living creatures on earth. Ungodly marriages happen throughout the Old Testament. None of them produces a global flood. The Sethite interpretation requires you to read the text against itself at almost every point. It requires the sons of God to mean something the term never means. It requires the Nephilim to be produced by something that could not produce them. And it requires the flood to be a response disproportionate beyond any rational accounting to the problem it supposedly addresses. The second interpretation is the royal lineage view. This understanding, found in some ancient sources, sees the sons of God as powerful human kings or rulers, perhaps of the ancient Near Eastern royal dynasties, who claimed divine status as part of their royal ideology. On this reading, the daughters of man are ordinary women taken forcibly into royal harems, and the Nephilim are the offspring of those unions, powerful warrior aristocrats produced by the ruling class. This interpretation has slightly more to recommend it in terms of explaining the Nephilim as powerful human warriors. But it faces the same fundamental problem as the Sethite view. The term Bnei Ha-Elohim does not refer to human kings anywhere else in the Old Testament, and it still cannot explain why the production of a royal warrior class would warrant the extinction of virtually all life on earth. The third interpretation is the angelic view, and this is the oldest interpretation. It predates Christianity. It was the dominant understanding in Jewish scholarship for centuries before the Christian era. It is the interpretation embedded in the oldest Jewish texts outside the Bible itself that engage with Genesis 6, and it is the interpretation that the New Testament itself appears to assume without explanation. precisely because it was so widely known that no explanation was considered necessary. On the angelic view, the sons of God in Genesis 6 are exactly what the term means everywhere else it appears in the Hebrew Bible. They are supernatural beings, members of the divine council, angelic entities who existed before the creation of humanity. And what Genesis 6 is describing is an event of cosmic transgression. A group of these supernatural beings chose to abandon their proper domain, cross the boundary between the spiritual and the physical, take human women as wives, and produce offspring that were neither fully human nor fully angelic, but something that had never existed before. Those offspring were the Nephilim. This interpretation does not require the text to mean something it does not say. The sons of God means exactly what it always means. The daughters of man means ordinary human women. The Nephilim are the result of a union that was never meant to happen, and the flood becomes comprehensible as the divine response to a corruption of the created order so fundamental that it could not be remedied by ordinary means. But how do we know this was the ancient understanding? How do we know that this is not a modern sensationalist reading imposed on an ancient text? This is where the Dead Sea Scrolls become essential, and this is where the story gets extraordinary. In the autumn of 1946, a Bedouin shepherd boy named Mohammed Dib was searching for a lost goat in the rocky hills above the Dead Sea. In the region of Qumran on the northwest shore, he threw a stone into a cave opening in the cliff face and heard the sound of breaking pottery. He and his companions went back the next day to investigate. What they found inside that cave were ancient clay jars containing leather scrolls wrapped in linen. Those scrolls had been hidden in those caves by a Jewish community, most likely the Essenes, sometime around 68 AD, when the Romans were advancing through Judea. They were preserved by the extraordinary dryness of the Dead Sea region. They had been sitting in those caves for approximately 1900 years. The discovery expanded as more caves were explored. 11 caves in total yielded manuscripts, hundreds of scrolls and tens of thousands of fragments. The collection, now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, represents the largest and most significant archaeological discovery related to the Bible ever made. And among the texts discovered at Qumran, the ones that deal most extensively with Genesis 6 and the story of the Nephilim are among the most extraordinary. The Book of Enoch was found in multiple copies at Qumran. It is one of the most complete non-biblical texts in the collection, and it is entirely devoted to the story that Genesis 6 describes in 6 verses. What Enoch does is expand those 6 verses into a full narrative, providing names, details, and theological interpretation that the Qumran community clearly considered authoritative. Before we go into what Enoch says, we need to establish something critical. The Book of Enoch is not in the Protestant or Catholic biblical canon. It is in the canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which has preserved it for 2,000 years as scripture. But even if you do not accept it as canonical, its importance for understanding how ancient Jews read Genesis 6 is beyond dispute. The New Testament itself quotes from or alludes to Enoch. Jude 14:15 quotes directly from 1 Enoch 1:9, and Peter's language in 1 Peter 3:19-20 and 2 Peter 2:4-5 about spirits in prison and angels who sinned is almost certainly drawing on the Enochic tradition. These New Testament authors expected their readers to know the story Enoch told. They wrote as if the angelic interpretation of Genesis 6 was the shared background knowledge of their audience. So what does Enoch say? The Book of Enoch, specifically the section known as the Book of the Watchers, which is chapters 1 through 36, names the supernatural beings of Genesis 6. It calls them the Watchers, the Iran in Aramaic, and it identifies their leader as Semyaza, with a group of 200 who together took an oath to carry out their plan. And it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the watchers, the children of the heaven, saw and lusted after them and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men and beget us children. The text is explicit. These are supernatural beings who make a deliberate collective decision to cross a boundary they know they should not cross. They are aware of the transgression. They take an oath together, because each of them knows that alone they might be too afraid to do it, but together if they all swear, none of them can back out. Enoch then names them. 200 watchers, organized into groups with named leaders: Semyaza, Azazel, Arakiel, Ramiel, Kokabel, Ezekiel, Arakiel, Samsik, Zakiel, Balkiel. Azazel, in particular, receives extended treatment in Enoch and is associated not only with the corruption produced by the union with human women, but with specific forbidden knowledge that the Watchers taught to humanity. This is one of the most important elements of the Enochic tradition, and it appears in a compressed form in Genesis 6 itself. The Nephilim are described as the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown, but Enoch goes further. It says the Watchers taught humanity things they were not supposed to know. Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and all coloring tinctures. In other words, the Watchers brought advanced knowledge, metallurgy, weapons making, cosmetics, enchantments, astrology, root cutting, and medicines. The Enochic tradition frames this as a corruption of human civilization. Humanity was advancing in ways it was not supposed to advance, on a timeline it was not supposed to follow, with knowledge it was not ready to handle, and that would be used for violence and destruction. The offspring of the Watchers and the human women were called the Nephilim, and in Enoch's account, they were giants. Not metaphorically giant, physically extraordinarily large. The text specifies their height, though the numbers in different manuscripts vary, and their behavior is described with horror. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 300 cubits, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. 300 cubits is an obviously hyperbolic number in the late manuscripts, but the core tradition is consistent across multiple ancient sources. The Nephilim were giants. They were violent. They devoured. They corrupted. And the earth groaned under their presence. Now let us go back to the Bible itself, because the Bible, even in its 6 compressed verses, confirms more of this picture than most readers realize. The word Nephilim in Hebrew comes from the root naphal, which means to fall. The Nephilim are, at the most basic etymological level, the fallen ones, or the ones produced by the fallen ones. The exact parsing has been debated for centuries, but the association with falling, with descent, with a crossing of proper boundaries, is built into the very name. They are described in the Hebrew as Gibborim, mighty men. This is a specific term in the Old Testament that carries connotations of violent power, of warriors, of extraordinary physical capability. The same word is used later in the Bible to describe warriors of exceptional strength and ferocity, and they are described as Anshe Hashem, men of renown. In Hebrew, Shem means name, but it also means fame, reputation, legend. The Nephilim were famous. Their stories were told. They were the giants of ancient memory, the figures of legend that every ancient civilization has in its stories of the time before the flood. This is one of the most remarkable convergences in the study of ancient history. Virtually every ancient civilization that has been studied by archaeologists and historians has stories of a time before a great flood when giants and demigods walked the earth. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. The Greeks called them the Titans and the demigods, the offspring of the gods and human women. The Babylonians had their own versions. The Egyptians had theirs. The Canaanites preserved these traditions. The Norse had the Jotnar. The Vedic traditions of India had their own race of giants. Every ancient civilization remembers a time when the boundary between the divine and the human was crossed, when the offspring of that crossing were mighty and terrible, and when a great catastrophe ended that era. The Bible is not borrowing from those traditions. The Bible is describing the same historical reality that all of those traditions are remembering in their own distorted way. The Nephilim were real. They were historical. They were the source of the giant legends of every ancient culture on earth. And Genesis 6, in 6 verses, gives you the accurate theological account of what actually happened and why. Now we come to the flood, because the flood is not simply a natural disaster in the biblical account. It is a judicial act, a divine intervention in response to a specific problem. Genesis 6:5 says the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And then verse 12, God saw the earth, and behold it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. All flesh, not most flesh, not some flesh, all flesh had corrupted their way. This language is extreme, and it raises a question. How had things gotten so bad so quickly? The answer the angelic interpretation provides is coherent in a way the Sethite interpretation cannot match. If the Watchers had crossed into the physical realm, if they had produced offspring who were neither human nor angelic, if those offspring were violent beyond any normal human violence, if they were consuming everything in their path, if the genetic and spiritual corruption produced by the Watcher incursion was spreading through the human population, if the knowledge the Watchers had transmitted was being used to accelerate violence and destruction, then the description of all flesh having corrupted their way becomes understandable. The flood was not a punishment for bad behavior. It was a surgical intervention to remove a corruption that had compromised the integrity of the human line itself. This is why Noah is described the way he is in Genesis 6:9. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. That phrase blameless in his generation translates the Hebrew tamim, which in other contexts refers to physical perfection or completeness. Some scholars have argued that Noah's selection was not only about his moral righteousness, but about his genetic integrity, that his lineage had not been contaminated by the Nephilim corruption. Whether or not you accept that reading, the text is describing Noah as something exceptional, in a world where everything had been corrupted. The flood removes the corruption. The Nephilim die in the flood. Their bodies cease to exist. But here the tradition preserved in Enoch and other Second Temple Jewish texts adds something that the Bible itself implies, but does not state fully. The spirits of the Nephilim, being the offspring of supernatural fathers and human mothers, were in an anomalous condition after their physical death. They were not fully human and could not go to the place human spirits go. They were not angelic and could not return to the angelic realm. They were, according to the tradition in Enoch, something new and terrible. They became what the Bible calls unclean spirits, demons. This is a tradition that appears in multiple Second Temple Jewish texts, not just Enoch. The Book of Jubilees, also found at Qumran, preserves it. The Testament of Solomon engages with it, and it may be the background for the way Jesus and the New Testament writers speak about demons and unclean spirits in a way that is curiously specific. When Jesus heals the demoniac of Gadarene in Mark 5, the demon's name is Legion because we are many. They beg not to be sent out of the region. They beg to be allowed to go into the pigs. The behavior of these entities in the Gospels, their desire to inhabit physical bodies, their discomfort without a physical host, their territorial nature, makes more sense in the context of the Enochic tradition than in any other framework. These are entities that were once embodied and that are desperately trying to be embodied again, because existence without a body is, for them, a kind of torment. Matthew 12:43 records Jesus saying that when an unclean spirit goes out of a person, it passes through waterless places, seeking rest and finds none. The image of an entity wandering in dry, desolate places, unable to rest, seeking a body, fits the picture of Nephilim spirits displaced from their physical existence by the flood and wandering the earth in a state of disembodied agony. I am not telling you this is the definitive explanation of what demons are. The Bible does not give us a single comprehensive account of the origin of evil spirits, but I am telling you that this tradition is ancient, that it was widespread in the Jewish world of the first century, that the New Testament writers expected their readers to know it, and that it provides a coherent framework for understanding passages that otherwise resist explanation. Now we come to the question that many people have when they hear this for the first time. If the flood destroyed the Nephilim, why do giants appear again after the flood? This is one of the most important questions in the entire discussion, and it has a direct biblical answer that is hiding in plain sight. Genesis 6:4 contains a phrase that is easy to miss. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. Also afterward. 2 words in English, 2 words in Hebrew, and those 2 words are doing enormous theological work. Also afterward means the Nephilim did not end with the flood. They appeared again. And the rest of the Old Testament confirms exactly that. Numbers 13 is the account of the 12 spies sent by Moses to scout the land of Canaan. 10 of the 12 come back with what the text calls an evil report, and in that report they describe what they saw. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers. And so we seem to them. Numbers 13:33. The sons of Anak, the Anakim. These are a people group who appear repeatedly in the Old Testament as giants who inhabited the land of Canaan before the Israelite conquest. Deuteronomy 9:2 describes them. Who can stand before the sons of Anak? Deuteronomy 2:10-11 says the Anakim were regarded as Rephaim, another term for giants. And Joshua 11:21-22 records that Joshua cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, from all the hill country of Israel. But some were left in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. Gath, the city that would later produce Goliath and his relatives. 2 Samuel 21 describes 4 giants who fell in battle against David and his warriors. One of them, from the same verse we mentioned earlier, had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. Goliath himself is described in 1 Samuel 17:4 as 6 cubits and a span in height, which, depending on the cubit measurement used, comes to somewhere between 9 and 11 feet tall. These are not metaphors. These are not literary exaggerations. They are precise, specific, historical accounts of individuals whose physical dimensions were extraordinary. And the biblical text links them explicitly to the Anakim, who are linked explicitly to the Nephilim, who appear in Genesis 6 as the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of man. But how did they survive the flood? The text does not give us a simple answer, but the tradition embedded in the phrase "also afterward" suggests that the same thing that happened before the flood happened again afterward. Genesis 6:4 says the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The past tense, and the reference to those days, and also afterward, implies that the incursion of the sons of God into the human sphere was not a one-time event, but something that happened in a pre-flood period and then happened again. This reading is supported by the behavior of the Canaanite peoples in the land God promised to Israel. The conquest of Canaan is described in terms that have troubled many readers. God commands the total destruction of specific people groups: the Amalekites, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Why such total destruction? Why not simply drive them out or subjugate them? The tradition preserved in Enoch and Jubilees suggests that at least some of these peoples were not simply ordinary human enemies of Israel, but populations that had been corrupted by another incursion of the Watcher tradition. They were the post-flood Nephilim. Their destruction was not ethnic cleansing in the modern sense. It was the removal of a corruption from the land that God had set apart, a corruption that had the same source as the pre-flood corruption that necessitated the flood. This framework does not resolve every moral question the conquest raises, but it does provide a context that the text itself seems to assume, and that the ancient Jewish readers of these accounts would have understood. Now let us spend time on what the Dead Sea Scrolls specifically add to this picture, beyond what we find in the Book of Enoch. The Genesis Apocryphon, one of the most significant scrolls found at Qumran, is an Aramaic retelling and expansion of parts of Genesis. The portion dealing with the flood and its immediate context expands on exactly this material. In the Genesis Apocryphon, Noah himself is described in terms that suggest uncertainty about his nature. His father Lamech, on seeing the extraordinary appearance of the newborn Noah, fears that the child might be the offspring of a watcher rather than his own son. This is extraordinary. It means that the watcher incursion was so widespread, so thoroughly integrated into the reality of that world, that a father could legitimately wonder whether his own son was fully human. The Genesis Apocryphon has Lamech going to his father Methuselah, who goes to Enoch himself to find out the truth about Noah's origins. Enoch confirms that Noah is Lamech's son, a fully human child. But the very fact that the question had to be asked tells you something about the world Genesis 6 is describing. The Dead Sea Scrolls also preserve what scholars call the Book of Giants, another text from the Enochic tradition. The Book of Giants gives us names of specific Nephilim offspring and describes their experiences as the flood approaches. They have dreams, terrifying dreams that they cannot interpret. They go to one of the Watchers for an interpretation, and the interpretation is always the same. The flood is coming. Your days are numbered. The judgment of God against what you represent is final. The giants in the Book of Giants are not triumphant. They are terrified. They know something is coming that they cannot stop. And this detail, the terror of the Nephilim before the flood, is one of the most human elements of an otherwise inhuman story. There is also at Qumran the community rule and the war scroll, both of which deal extensively with the cosmic battle between light and darkness, between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, between the angels of God and the angels of Belial. The worldview of the Qumran community was saturated with the awareness of a spiritual conflict that had its roots in the events of Genesis 6. They were not reading that passage as an allegory about bad marriages. They were reading it as the foundational account of a cosmic war that was still ongoing, that had produced demonic entities still active in the world, and that would only be resolved by the final intervention of God at the end of the age. This is the ancient Jewish understanding of Genesis 6, not the sanitized, rationalized, Sethite interpretation that became dominant in later Christian tradition, largely because it was more comfortable. The ancient understanding, the one preserved in the texts found at Qumran, the one that the New Testament writers assumed as background knowledge, the one that Jude quotes directly, and Peter alludes to, is the angelic interpretation. Let us now look at the New Testament passages that engage with this tradition, because they are some of the most puzzling verses in the entire New Testament, and they become significantly less puzzling when you understand the Enochic background. Jude 6:7. And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Jude is describing angels who left their proper dwelling. The Greek word for dwelling here is oikoterion, which appears only twice in the entire New Testament, and both times it refers to a bodily habitation. Angels who left their proper dwelling are angels who abandoned their proper, non-physical mode of existence and entered into physical embodiment. Jude compares this directly to the sexual sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, which involved the pursuit of unnatural desire. The parallel implies that what the angels did was similarly unnatural, a crossing of the boundaries of their created nature. These angels are being held in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment. Not all fallen angels, specific fallen angels, the ones who committed this specific transgression. They are imprisoned. They are not free. They are awaiting judgment. Who are these imprisoned angels? Jude 14 quotes Enoch directly. It is Enoch who tells us who they are. They are the Watchers of Genesis 6. And Jude, writing to a first-century Jewish Christian audience, simply assumes they know the story. He quotes Enoch like a well-known text precisely because it was well-known. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirm that it was circulating widely in the Jewish world of the time. 2 Peter 2:4-5. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. Peter connects the imprisonment of sinning angels directly to the flood. He puts them in the same sentence. The angels sinned. God sent the flood. These are not two unrelated events. They are cause and effect. The angels sinned in the way Genesis 6 describes. The flood was part of the response. 1 Peter 3:18-20 is the most mysterious of these passages. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh but made alive in the Spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared. Christ, after his death and before his resurrection, went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, spirits who formerly did not obey in the days of Noah. These are the imprisoned watchers, the same ones Jude describes, the same ones Peter described in his second letter. And Christ, between his death and resurrection, went to where they are being held and made a proclamation to them. What was the proclamation? The text does not say what was proclaimed, but the word used is not euangelizo, which means to preach the gospel. It is kerusso, which means to make a proclamation or announcement. In the ancient world, kerusso was often used for the announcement of victory after a battle. The herald would go through the city proclaiming that the king had won. The implication, which has been drawn by many serious New Testament scholars, is that Christ went to the imprisoned watchers and announced his victory. The cross and resurrection had accomplished what no human power and no previous divine intervention had fully accomplished. The cosmic war that began when the watchers crossed the boundary in Genesis 6 was over. The victory belonged to the Son of God, and the announcement of that victory was made to the very beings whose rebellion had been one of the primary catalysts of the catastrophe. The victory had now resolved. The cross was not only about individual forgiveness of sins, though it is fully and gloriously that. The cross was a cosmic event. It was the decisive battle in a war that had been going on since before the flood, and its victory reverberated all the way to the prison where the watchers have been held since the days of Noah. Colossians 2:15 describes the cross in exactly these cosmic terms. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. Rulers and authorities in Paul's theological vocabulary refers to the spiritual powers that stand behind and animate the kingdoms and structures of this world. The cross disarmed them. The cross put them to open shame. The cross triumphed over them. This is not the language of individual salvation only. This is the language of cosmic victory in a war that began in Genesis 6. Now let us bring everything together. Because this story, as extraordinary as it is not an abstract theological curiosity. It has direct implications for how we understand the world we live in, the spiritual conflict that surrounds us, and the significance of what Christ accomplished on the cross. We live in a world that the Bible describes as a spiritual battleground. Ephesians 6:12, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." This is not poetry. This is Paul's theological description of reality. The world is inhabited by spiritual powers that are actively hostile to human flourishing and to the purposes of God. Where do those powers come from? The Bible gives us glimpses rather than a complete systematic account, but the Genesis 6 tradition, as understood by the ancient Jewish world and as engaged by the New Testament writers, suggests that the roots of that spiritual hostility go back to the watcher, rebellion. The spirits produced by that rebellion, the disembodied Nephilim, wander seeking to inhabit bodies. The imprisoned watchers, held in chains since the days of Noah, await their judgment. And behind them all, the one the New Testament calls the ruler of this world, the one who animated the serpent in the garden and who took an oath with the watchers in Enoch, continues to pursue his agenda of destruction and corruption. The good news, and it is very good news, is that the cross has already decided the outcome of this war. The announcement has already been made to the imprisoned watchers. The cosmic powers have already been disarmed. The ruler of this world has already been judged. John 16:11. The end of the story is not in doubt. What remains is the working out of that victory across time, the proclamation of that victory to every corner of the earth, and the final culmination of that victory when the one who folded the napkin returns to set everything right and make all things new. Revelation 20:1-3. describes a future moment when an angel comes down from heaven, holding the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. The binding language echoes the binding of the watchers in Enoch, the chains of gloomy darkness in Jude and Peter. The cosmic imprisonment, that is the divine response to the Watcher rebellion, is the pattern for the final binding of the one who stood behind that rebellion. The story that begins in Genesis 6 does not end until Revelation 20, and the cross of Jesus Christ is the center point of that entire story, the decisive event that made the ending inevitable. This is why the Nephilim matter. Not because they are fascinating historical curiosities, though they are. Not because the giants of the Old Testament give us something to marvel at, though they do, but because they are part of a cosmic story that the Bible is telling from Genesis to Revelation, a story about a war between the Creator and the forces of rebellion and corruption, a war that was decided at the cross and that will be consummated at the return. And you are not a spectator to that story. You are a participant in it. Ephesians 1:20-22 says that God raised Christ from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and above every name that is named, not only in this age but also in the one to come. And he put all things under his feet, all things, all rulers, all authorities, all powers, all dominions, all the spiritual forces that have their origin in the rebellion that began before the flood and was consummated in Genesis 6. All of them are already under the feet of the risen Christ, and those who belong to him are seated with him in those heavenly places. Ephesians 2:6. You are not fighting a war to see who wins. You are fighting from a position of victory already secured, proclaiming the triumph of the one who went to the imprisoned watchers and made his announcement, proclaiming the triumph of the one who disarmed the cosmic powers at the cross, proclaiming the triumph of the one whose empty tomb with its folded cloth announced to anyone with eyes to see that the Master had stepped away from the table and would return. The Nephilim were real. The Watchers were real. The corruption they produced was real. The flood that addressed that corruption was real. The giants of Canaan were real. The cosmic war that runs from Genesis 6 to Revelation 20 is real, and the victory of Jesus Christ over every dimension of that war is real. That is the story the Dead Sea Scrolls help us read more fully. That is the story the Book of Enoch illuminates. That is the story hiding in 6 verses in Genesis 6 that most churches never fully preach and most believers never fully understand. Now you understand it. I want to end with a question that I think is the right question to carry out of everything we have just explored together. Most people, when they first hear this material, have one of two reactions. Either they are fascinated and want to go deeper, or they are unsettled and want to pull back. Both reactions are understandable. This is not comfortable material. It is not the kind of thing that makes you feel safe and cozy. It is the kind of thing that expands your sense of what the world actually is and what is actually at stake. But here is what I want you to consider. A God big enough to be troubled by none of this is the God the Bible actually presents. The Watchers rebelled. God responded. The Nephilim corrupted the earth. God sent the flood. The giants of Canaan stood in the way of the promise. God gave his people the victory over them one by one. The cosmic powers stood arrayed against the purposes of God for all of human history. God sent his Son, and the Son won. None of what Genesis 6 describes surprised God. None of what the Dead Sea Scrolls illuminate about the ancient understanding of that passage changes the fundamental reality that the one who created everything that exists, seen and unseen, was, and is and always will be larger than everything that has tried to stand against him. The Nephilim were mighty men, men of renown. But the one who sent the flood was mightier. The Watchers took an oath together to cross the boundary they were not supposed to cross. But the one who holds the keys to the bottomless pit knows where they are and when their judgment will come. The cosmic powers arrayed against the purposes of God looked triumphant on Friday afternoon at Golgotha. But on Sunday morning a cloth was folded in an empty tomb, and everything they thought they had won was revealed to be everything they had lost. That is the God of Genesis 6. That is the God of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That is the God of the cross and the empty tomb, and he is not finished. If this opens something in you today, something that makes you want to go back to these passages with fresh eyes and read them as if for the first time, do it. Read Genesis 6, read Jude, read 2 Peter 2, read 1 Peter 3, read Enoch if you can find it, and read it all knowing that what you are reading is not mythology and not allegory and not the confused speculation of ancient people who did not know any better. You are reading the true story of the world you live in, the world that is more contested, more populated with spiritual realities, and more profoundly under the sovereign care of God than most of us have been taught to see. Share this with someone who is ready to go deeper. Someone who has always sensed that the Bible was bigger than what they had been shown. Someone who is not afraid of questions that do not have easy answers because they trust the one who holds all the answers and has already secured the victory. And subscribe to this channel because we have only just begun. The 70 weeks of Daniel, the Ark of the Covenant, the 18 silent years of Jesus, the 2 witnesses of Revelation. There is a depth to this book that will take a lifetime to explore. And we are going to explore it together. The Nephilim were real, and the one who defeated everything they represented is more real still.